Yes, folks, without question, Jacinda Ardern is a communist through and through. And we clearly saw that in my last video. And today's video kind of follows on from that. Now, in a video I'm going to show you today, Jacinda Ardern addresses an audience in New York at a Bill Gates event in 2019. And hat tip to renovation specialists for this one. Now, at that event, besides being a lying, virtue-signalling hypocrite, Jacinda openly discusses how she's implementing the UN Agenda 2030 into New Zealand policy making. But first, let's have a look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals these global communists are forcing on us. Oh, I feel so warm and fuzzy inside. Anyway, now to our dear leader.
She's done all of this after only being in office for 2 years, so I'm excited to welcome here a true international leader who understands the future of the world depends on eliminating inequality. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Kia ora koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou.
So the first thing you notice is this. That's all the Maori she can speak. And the second is this. There are no Maori in the audience. So why is she speaking Maori?
And thank you so much for the warmth of your welcome today. If it's not entirely obvious to all of you, I was born in the 1980s, the decade of big hair, big shoulders, and very big reforms. A decade where New Zealand went through a period of rapid privatisation and rapid economic liberalisation. While many have argued that aspects of these reforms were needed to open our economy to the world, the pace of change undeniably came with a high price. Jobs were lost.
So that's why Helen Clark signed the free trade agreement with China, to help our jobs.
Manufacturing moved offshore, regulations were removed, and the gap between rich and poor quickly expanded. Then came the 1990s, and New Zealand introduced further reforms that brought user pay to the fore and welfare cuts for the most vulnerable. Now, I was young when all of this was still happening, but I do still remember it. I was the daughter of a policeman in a town of just 3,000 people, and I only had to look around me to see people being left behind. Now, if it's possible to begin building your social conscience when you are just a small child, then that is what happened to me. Now, I never viewed the world through the lens of politics, not then, and in many ways I still don't now. Instead, I try to view it through the lens of children.
Yes, people of your level.
And people, and through the most basic concept and idea of fairness. When I eventually signed up to a political party when I was 17 years old, I wasn't particularly looking for a career. I wanted, perhaps naively, to change the world. I was promptly handed 300 leaflets and told to start changing the world one letterbox at a time. The world has changed immeasurably since then, though. We are both more connected, and yet we are more partisan and more tribal than ever.
Ah, so that's why you peddle identity politics, to bring people together.
Inequality has progressed almost as rapidly as development. Now, but thankfully, there are some values that endure. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have always tried to look out for each other and tried to do right by one another. Our track record of striving for equality and our values of compassion.
Ah, so compassion was the reason behind the abortion up to birth bill. Compassion for babies.
And fairness are often sources of national pride, but that hasn't always translated into the progress and the gains that we need. But, you know, when it comes to a set of rules for a country to live by, you would struggle to do better than the SDGs. Now, any serious politician would be hard-pressed to argue with goals like halving poverty or providing decent work or quality education and clean water and peace and justice for all. And yet here we are, still struggling. Now, perhaps it's time to acknowledge that it's not the aspiration that is the problem, but the domestic political environments in which we are trying to embed them. Now, let me try and explain what I mean by that. As in many countries, our success in New Zealand has traditionally been measured in purely economic terms. And on these terms, New Zealand has been relatively successful, with rates of growth that international commentators have remarked upon and widely commended. However, the deficiency of such measures has become really clear. The reforms of the 80s and 90s that I referenced just before, they have left an enduring mark on our society. While many people in New Zealand enjoy an enviable quality of life, our social statistics, they tell another story for too many. Unacceptable rates of child poverty, a growing homelessness problem, heartbreaking rates of suicide, and distressingly high family violence.
So that's why you do everything you can to actually destroy real families in New Zealand. Real families with real fathers and real mothers. Yes, you do everything you possibly can to destroy them. So you do this to reduce these problems, do you?
Now, these problems, they are an affront to our national values, and yet they are lived experience for far too many people in our country. Economic growth accompanied by worsening social outcomes is not success. It is failure. And turning things around requires changing both the way we think and the way we act and the way we measure success. So to tackle these issues in New Zealand, the government I'm proud to lead is doing something not many other countries have tried. We've incorporated the principles of the 2030 Agenda into our domestic policy making in a way that...
Well, okay, I'll just repeat that, folks, to make sure it resonates. We have incorporated the principles of the 2030 Agenda into our domestic policy making. So there you have it, folks. We've already started this global communist Chinese UN agenda.
We hope will drive system-level actions. This is not just a new scorecard. It is about fundamentally changing how we make decisions and therefore how we allocate resources. For instance, when deciding where to spend public money and manage our national assets, we've decided it's no longer enough to ask what will drive economic growth. Now the question that we as politicians are asking is, what will do the most to improve both the lives of New Zealanders now, but also in the future? Now, to help us answer that question, in New Zealand, we've been having our Treasury developing what's called a living standards framework that measures well-being, it measures risk, it measures resilience across economic, social and environmental domains. It puts sustainable intergenerational well-being at the heart of our decision-making, not just economic growth. Now this year we delivered our first well-being budget in May. Oh, thank you. I didn't expect you to notice. It took an evidence-based approach and it focused investments in areas like child poverty reduction, helping homeless people off the street into supported living, sexual and family violence services, and delivering on the aspirations of Māori, our Indigenous people. The centrepiece of the wellbeing budget was the largest ever investment in mental health services New Zealand has ever seen. And this has included the development of a new frontline service where people can get support for mental health needs at their doctor in the same way that they would for a physical ailment. Now, we're investing in mental health because ignoring it is a stain on our society and a drain on our economy. Now, our investment will help people ultimately, we believe, live more fulfilling lives. And a byproduct of that, of course, is that it will increase productivity. That is what real, genuine well-being looks like. It's a values-driven approach to economic success. But it's not just through new policies and programs where we can embed these principles of well-being. For instance, trade is fundamental to New Zealand's economic prosperity. We are a small trading nation, always have been. Well, we are bringing inclusive and sustainability principles to our trade agenda, including by pursuing environmental outcomes in our trade agreements, such as an end to subsidies that encourage illegal fishing. And we strongly advocate for respecting and advancing global rules in the WTO to ensure trade is conducted fairly rather than on the basis of power.
So that's why you've joined Communist China in this global agenda.
And for more on this, we have in our Beijing studio, Cui Hongjian, Director of the Department for European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies, and Nicholas Rossellini, who is the resident coordinator of the United Nations in China, who's also a resident representative of UNDP, United Nations Development Program, here in this country. Welcome, gentlemen, to both of you. I want to start with you, Mr. Rossellini, about the United Nations role and China's initiative on the Belt and Road. How does that work together?
Well, I see them as two very important global initiatives that are really coming together at the moment. The SDGs...
Sustainable Development Goals, 17
yes.
of them.
Yeah, I mustn't use jargon. Sustainable Development Goals. Those were agreed by all the member states of the United Nations back in 2015, and 2016 was the first year of implementation. It gives a universal framework to make the lives of everyone around the world better, regardless of people living in a rich or a poor country, a developed country or a developing country.
SDG was also the ones being passed by the UN when the Chinese President Xi Jinping was there to attend the assembly meeting.
And China's really become now, since then, a champion of the SDGs, both domestically in terms of incorporating it into China's own development planning, as well as internationally in terms of supporting it in international fora and creating trust funds and investment for the Sustainable Development Goals.
But what about BRI? I mean, Belt and Road Initiative, how does that work together?
Well, the Belt and Road Initiative is coming from a slightly different direction. It's coming from the idea of connectivity, infrastructure. But if you look at the SDGs, that is also looking for improving infrastructure, for creating jobs, as well as continuing to improve services such as health and education. So the Belt and Road Initiative is actually very much a platform that can help accelerate the delivery of the SDGs.
Are we going to see redundance of the projects, or actually projects going to complement one another, and the roles of the United Nations or the roles of the countries involved on the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, going to complement one another?
we are trying to find out some connectivity or some integration between the SDG and the BRI. Yes, once we have some more projects on the BRI and in some especially countries alongside the road and belt, certainly we can find out the embody of this SDG. Otherwise, we just have something on table. We could not have something, to show how is efficiency and how is this implementation of SDG.
That's right. It seems that China is eager, together with many partners along the Belt and Road Initiative, try to have some lower hanging fruits, to have some early harvest, as an example, so that the others also want to follow suit and also be more inspirational. So, Mr. Rossellini, I guess this has a lot to do with how SDG has been doing and working here in China. You and your colleagues working a lot on the public-private partnerships. Will there be experiences, lessons learned in those practices that could help with the BRI initiative?
I think they can certainly support each other. What the SDGs say is that it's not just about what your goals are in terms of improving people's lives and their well-being. It's also about what kind of partnerships you need to achieve those goals and where the resources are coming from, what kind of financing is available. And I think for the first time in terms of the international development community, we're trying to work very closely together with all parts of society, not just with governments and member states, but also with the private sector and with civil society. And we're looking at a bill for the SDGs which could approach, for developing countries, $2 to $3 trillion a year.
All right.
The envelope for the whole world, developed and developing, is $5 to $7 trillion a year. And no one can do this by themselves. It needs the support of the international community through traditional development cooperation assistance.
So in other words, the redistribution of wealth from the first world to the third world. Anyway, now to the truth.
The United Nations and its mostly autocratic member regimes have big plans for your life, your children, your country, and your world. And those plans are not limited to the coercive climate agreement recently concluded in Paris. While the establishment media in the United States was hyping ISIS, football, and of course global warming, virtually every national government, dictatorship on the planet met at the 70th Annual General Assembly at UN headquarters in New York to adopt a draconian 15-year master plan for the planet. Top globalists such as former NATO chief Javier Solana, a socialist, are celebrating the plan, which the summit unanimously approved, as the next great leap forward. Yes, the old campaign slogan of the Chinese Communist Party. The master plan is comprised of 17 post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, with 169 specific targets to be foisted on all of humanity, literally all of it, as the planet self states explicitly. As we embark on this collective journey, we pledge that no one will be left behind, reads the UN Manifesto, entitled Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. But if you love liberty, self-government, free markets, or the US Constitution, you will almost certainly be wishing that the UN would leave you behind. Officially dubbed Agenda 2030, the UN plot, as its full title suggests, is aimed at transforming the world. The program is a follow-up to the last 15-year UN plan, the defunct Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs. It also dovetails nicely with the deeply controversial UN Agenda 21, even including much of the same rhetoric and agenda. But the combined Agenda 2030 goals for achieving what is euphemistically called sustainable development represent previous UN plans on steroids, deeper, more radical, more draconian, and more expensive. This agenda is a plan of action for people, planet and prosperity, reads the preamble. All countries and all stakeholders, acting in collaborative partnership, will implement this plan. Ironically, The preamble even claims the UN goals will free the human race from the tyranny of poverty and heal the planet, or, as the planet is also referred to in the document, Mother Earth. Not so subtly purporting to usurp the role of God, the UN even claimed that the future of humanity and of our planet lies in our hands. Speaking on September 25 at the opening ceremony of the confab that adopted Agenda 2030, Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon hinted at just how far-reaching the plot really is. The new agenda is a promise by leaders to all people everywhere, he explained, presumably conflating leaders with mass-murdering gangsters such as Kim Jong-un, Raul Castro, Robert Mugabe, and other despots who hold great sway with most of the regimes comprising the United Nations. It is a universal, integrated and transformative vision for a better world. We need action from everyone, everywhere, Ban said, pointing to the guide offered by the 17 SDGs. They are a to-do list for people and planet, and a blueprint for success. We must use the goals to transform the world, Ban continued. Institutions will have to become fit for a grand new purpose. The Agenda 2030 agreement makes the audacity of the scheme clear, too. This is an agenda of unprecedented scope and significance, boasts the document. Never before have world leaders pledged common action and endeavor across such a broad and universal policy agenda, the agreement continues. What we are announcing today, an agenda for global action for the next 15 years, is a charter for people and planet in the 21st century. The agenda. Perhaps the single most striking feature of Agenda 2030 is the practically undisguised roadmap to global socialism and corporatism, fascism, as countless analysts have pointed out. To begin with, consider the agenda's Goal 10, which calls on the UN, national governments, and every person on Earth to reduce inequality within and among countries. To do that, the agreement continues, will only be possible if wealth is shared and income inequality is addressed. As the UN document also makes clear, national socialism to combat inequality domestically is not enough. International socialism is needed to battle inequality even among countries. By 2030, ensure that all men and women, in particular the poor and the vulnerable, have equal rights to economic resources, the document demands. In simpler terms, Western taxpayers should prepare to be fleeced so that their wealth can be redistributed internationally as their own economies are cut down to size by big government. Of course, as has been the case for generations, most of the wealth extracted from the productive sector will be redistributed to the UN and third world regimes, not the victims of those regimes, impoverished largely through domestic socialist, totalitarian policies imposed by the same corrupt regimes to be propped up with more Western aid under Agenda 2030. Wealth redistribution alone, however, will not be enough. Governments must also seize control of the means of production, either directly or through fascist-style mandates. We commit to making fundamental changes in the way that our societies produce and consume goods and services, the document states. It also says that governments, international organizations, the business sector and other non-state actors and individuals must contribute to changing unsustainable consumption and production patterns, to move towards more sustainable patterns of consumption and production. In plain English, the Agenda 2030 document is claiming that today's consumption and production patterns are unsustainable, so we'll need to get by with less. How much less? It would be hard to find a more clear and concise assessment than that offered by the late Maurice Strong, the recently deceased Canadian billionaire and longtime UN environmental guru who led the 1992 Earth Summit. In a pre-Earth Summit document, it is clear that current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class, involving high meat intake, consumption of large amounts of frozen and convenience foods, ownership of motor vehicles, numerous electrical appliances, home and workplace air conditioning, expensive suburban housing, are not sustainable. In truth, Such lifestyles and consumption patterns are sustainable, so long as the freedom that makes prosperity possible is not destroyed in the name of achieving sustainability. The UN and the environmental lobby claim that we must get by with less because there are now too many people on the planet consuming too many resources. But this rationale for accepting UN-imposed scarcity is patently false. Of course, the promoters of Agenda 2030 would claim that rather than impoverish us, the global regime they envision would take good care of us, through universal health coverage, for instance. One of the targets for Goal 3, ensuring healthy lives and well-being, is achieve universal health coverage, including vaccines for all, universal access to mental health, along with sexual and reproductive health care services. Code words for abortion and contraception are also included. All governments are expected to integrate such services into their national strategies and programs, the agreement demands.
Yeah. Now, folks, I urge you to listen to the rest of that Vision Liberty video. So I've posted a link to it, along with the other videos in the description below. Now, without question, unless we completely pull out of the UN right now, these global communists will own us. So it's time to wake up the new Conservative Party on this issue